Welcome to this, the final presentation in the series where we've been looking at the book of Leviticus and how it applies to us today. In this presentation, I'm going to give a kind of quick overview of the main themes of the book and the implications for the people of God today. It was addressed to a rabble of former slaves. They'd been rescued miraculously from Egypt, and they were heading towards a new life in a fertile land called Canaan. At this time they were moving through a barren desert, from oasis to oasis. Tough going. Here were God's people for the future, and the book gives directions for a lifestyle that they would enjoy, make life rich and full and free, but a people with a destiny to make God known to the people groups round about, and they would do this through the quality of their lifestyle, making an impact on the nation groups and people groups and communities that lived around at that time. God's way to reach the world. There's an approximate picture of the land they were going to live in for a while. The land belongs to God, was never given unilaterally to the people. He gives it to his people as a secure base for a purpose. Because this people group had a destiny to fulfill. They were to reach the world with an understanding of God, Yahweh, the great God who made the universe. And they would do this through the quality of their living. That was the purpose of it all. And living in the land and getting the benefits of the land and the security of the land were all conditional on the fact that this people group had a destiny that was completed with the coming of Jesus, and that they would do this by the quality of their living. Before the book of Leviticus, words that were spoken through Moses to the people: "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." A kingdom of priests. They were to make God real to people round about. A holy nation. High quality living, fulfilled living, living the way God intended life to be lived, which is always going to be the best for us and for everyone. But there are conditions attached. They had to do it God's way. God was to be at the centre of their national as well as their personal lives. And they were to live within the boundary conditions that God was setting down for them. And that's what the book of Leviticus gives for us. It works out the practical implications of this. A people group with a destiny, with a purpose, who had little understanding of God, need to be taught the way to live that reflected the nature of God, so that they could fulfill their destiny and move into a glorious future. But how does this apply for us today? And in this series we've tried to look at this and try to unpack some of the great insights that Leviticus brings to us. I'm going to pick out some of them and draw these out for us today. Looking at the book overall, it's highly organized and systematic. It's a very clear structure. An awful lot of it relates to a sacrificial system that seems to us completely strange in our modern cultures, but underpinning that were great principles. Ideas of uncleanness and then ideas of practical holiness. The concept of uncleanness and cleanness isn't in our culture today, and yet underpinning that were great principles that apply for us today, and that leads on to living holy lives. The book, looking at all the evidence, that's the conclusion we can draw. The book was put together in the days of Moses, And it was to give the people a framework for desert living. And it was to prepare them to move forward when they were going into this land. So there are directions for things for their future when they were living in the land, so that they could fulfill their destiny to live for God, to live quality lives, rich lives, fulfilled lives, and make God known to people round about. A rabble of former slaves. They still thought in terms of slavery. They've been in slavery for ages in Egypt, abused and suffering, miraculously released, taken north, and now into the desert. Barbarically difficult surroundings, but they were moving on to something better. They scarcely knew Moses, because Moses had been banished to the desert long before. So they're under a leader they hardly knew. And probably they had little idea what was happening to them. They didn't understand. At times Moses was tearing his hair out in fistfuls in frustration at their unwillingness to take things on board. And what lay ahead? They'd never been there. It was unknown territory, an unknown destiny. And their knowledge of God was probably extremely limited. And Moses, who had learned so much about God, particularly in his desert experience as a shepherd, he had to make things known and teach them and direct them. And the book of Leviticus is part of this. And inevitably, they were going to be full of uncertainty and fear. And you can see the fear. At times they were hankering back, because in slavery they didn't have to worry about anything. They just had to do the grind of work. Here they were in a world of uncertainty, with an uncertain future. Hard going for them. When we look at the book, from time to time I have touched upon this. Looking back over history, no one has ever interpreted the book of Leviticus with the kind of rigid literalism that started to develop in the 19th century. It was a new development then, and people just took verses out of the text and applied them literalistically to the modern situation of the 19th and 20th century. Now, we wouldn't do this with any other book, but it's become a strong element, and it's done immense damage in our understanding of Leviticus. Leviticus is an inspired book because it carries an inspired meaning. The words are merely vehicles to transmit that meaning. Now, there are two important aspects of this. We have to take into account language, and we have to take into account the context of the book. It was written for a particular audience at a particular time of history, and that particular audience came at it from a particular perspective. We've got to interpret it the way they would have understood it, because it was addressed to them. But it illustrates and reveals fundamental principles. And if you take pieces of it and just literally lift them out and apply them willy-nilly to a modern 21st century society, you will get into trouble. It was never designed that way. We've got to be very careful with words. There is no way we can translate exactly words of these millennia ago. Ideas have changed. So we've got to be very careful on understanding the words, and I've tried to explain that. It's very straightforward. If we use a modern translation, the modern translators have made great efforts to get things meaningfully correct. And that removes a lot of the problems. If you go back to a version of the Bible that's based on a text of the 16th century, well, words have changed over 400 or 500 years. So we've got to be very careful. But we've also got to be very careful that the way things happened then, for a desert group of former slaves struggling to survive in a very tough environment, heading for an unknown world, that's very different from the 21st century lifestyles of the West. So we've got to interpret it carefully. And if we do that, there are wonderful insights that we can gain. The book centres, for the first part of it, a large stretch of it, on sacrifices. There is someone's picture of what the tabernacle, this mobile temple, might have looked like in the desert. Now, in the cultures of that day, offering food and objects, animals, or even humans to their god, that was common. It expressed devotion on the parts of the people. Sometimes it was seen as reducing divine anger, and sometimes it was a recognition that people had messed up. Now, in Egyptian culture, there were animal sacrifices, and it was very much for appeasing the gods. In some cultures, there were human sacrifices. If there was a major disaster, then they felt they'd done something terribly wrong, someone would be sacrificed to get into the good side of their god. And in the culture they were going to, there was child sacrifice. A terrible thing to do. But they thought that their god, a god of fertility, would bless their land and bless the number of children they had if they sacrificed a child. Very different world from today. You see, you've got to take into account the context. The sacrificial system was set against this background of previous knowledge and experience, and the expression of devotion. What the sacrifices are saying is, God has priority in my life because you give him the best animal. A recognition that we've messed up. And that comes up again and again in the sacrifices. And when they laid their hands on the head of an animal, saying, I've messed up and I want a better way. But anger is something which is greatly misunderstood. God, the Lord of the universe, is a God of love. But that God is angry. He is angry when anything or anyone messes up his creation. Indeed, he's angry here in the 21st century when he sees some of the things that we're doing in our societies today, because these things are hurting people. They're messing up people, destroying lives, messing up his creation. Exactly the same as a parent is angry if someone hurts their child. It's a very different thing from some sort of divine anger of seeing God as a kind of heavenly policeman waiting to jump down upon us because we're doing something he doesn't fancy. That's not a biblical idea. Sacrificial system is so important because God is perfect and holy. Now that was a new idea for the people. The gods of the other nations never had that. Perfect, holy, ethically and morally, everything is right. And yet we certainly are not. We rebel. We want to do it our way, not God's way. And the sacrificial offerings had a negative and a positive side to them. It recognized we've messed up. By trying to do it our way, we're not doing it God's way. We're missing out on God's best. But it's also an expression of faith, obedience and gratitude. Thank you, you've accepted us. Thank you, you're with us. Thank you, you'll provide for us. And God does, and he did. So the sacrificial offerings had a purpose and a place and a meaning. It was an outward expression of an inner response to God. Now, we don't do it that way today, but the principles are there. God has done so much for us. We mess up so often. It's our outward expression of inner response to God. That's where the sacrificial system fits. And if we look at it a little bit deeper, that was the God that was being revealed to them through Moses in their desert experience. God, the Lord of glory, who made everything, and he made human beings. And he wants the very best for us. God is love. But there are things that are right and wrong. Now that cuts right against the way the culture of the West today is going. What is seen as right is what the majority think is right. That's not God's way. There are things that are objectively right and things that are objectively wrong. Why are they right? Why are they wrong? Because what is right helps us to live fulfilled lives. What is wrong is liable to damage us. Different concept of right and wrong. And what Leviticus is stressing is that our human rebellion, our desire, I want to do it my way. And if we all want to do it my way, we end up conflicting with each other and people get hurt. Therefore it's wrong, because it's damaging God's creation. But human rebellion has consequences, because we miss out on that. And if you look at all the troubles within families, within communities, within the workplace, within nations, between nations, across the world, it's because people are saying, I want to do it my way. I want more. And if I want more, you get less. And so there's a conflict. And people get damaged, people get hurt. That's wrong. That's the definition of wrong. Because God made us and He wants the very best for us. There is objective right and wrong. A principle that Leviticus establishes. Because when we do it our way, we damage the divine image that God created in us. We were designed to be not just physical beings, but spiritual beings. And God has put within us a divine stamp. We can reflect in our lifestyle and behavior something of the God who made us. And when we choose to do it our way, that gets damaged. And relationships at the human level get disturbed. That's not what God wants. And what Leviticus is saying is, for things to move forward, the damage has to be corrected. You can't fudge the issue. You can't brush it under the carpet. The damage has to be corrected. And the sacrificial system makes that point. It costs us. In the Leviticus experience, they brought their best animal. For an agricultural people, that's a big cost. But there's a cost to God. And we see the cost most fully in what He did for us in the sacrifice of Jesus. The sacrificial system demonstrates principles. Only God has the power to put things right. God can make you holy. That's what God wants. He wants us to live fulfilled, rich lives. Lives where we enjoy everything to the full, doing it His way, because it's the best way. Only God has the power to put things right when we mess up, but we've got to be willing to let God put things right. And the sacrificial system demonstrates that. They had to be willing to have things put right. By bringing an animal, they were confessing, I and my family, we've messed up. I want things put right. And so the sacrificial system illustrates all of this beautifully. Fundamental principles of life. And of course this was fulfilled completely in all that Jesus did for us. And that brings us to atonement, a word that's misunderstood. You see, we assume that it means what we think it means. But in fact, if you study the Old Testament, it's not quite as straightforward as that. The word is very common in the Old Testament. Surprisingly, it's extremely rare in the New Testament. We make a lot of it, but it's extremely rare idea in the New Testament. But the key words that are used refer to the place of atonement. Not the act, the place. Because the word means a cover. And in the Old Testament, the place of atonement is the cover over the Ark of the Covenant. Inside the Ark were the 10 Commandments. And because of our rebellious nature, we break these. Above the Ark were the cherubim that symbolized the presence of God. The cover of the Ark lay between the presence of God and rebellious humanity. Atonement refers to a place. And if you look at the actual chapter 16 of Leviticus, you can see that blood was daubed on that place. Because that's the place of atonement. It's the bridge between a holy God and rebellious humanity. So we can summarize it that way. Atonement is the place where the bridge is created between a perfect God and his far from perfect creatures. And the high priest carried that out. Now the people couldn't see what he was doing, but when he came out and the goat was taken into the wilderness, taking away the sins, there was a visual picture of the bridge having been created. Jesus, the great high priest, as the book of Hebrews stresses, he was the high priest, but he was also the sacrifice. And the cross is the place where relationship can be restored, where the rebellion of humanity is covered and new direction can be given. And the whole atonement teaching of Leviticus gives us a wonderful picture of the principles that were fulfilled completely in the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. The bridge between God and humanity. If we look at all these rules and principles laid out in the book of Leviticus, there's an emphasis on meticulous detail. But you see, this people group couldn't read or write. They'd come out of slavery. They weren't the educated population that we have today in the West. The visual carried the meaning. So it had to be correct to carry the correct meaning. They didn't have teachers. They saw it visually. And it makes the point, you can't approach God casually or irreverently. God is the Lord of glory. They brought the best animal, symbolizing the recognition they wanted to give God the very, very best. And of course God provided the very best sacrifice in Jesus. But it makes an important point in Leviticus. You can go through all this religious ritual and it means absolutely nothing if your heart attitudes are wrong. Two of the sons of Aaron paid a great penalty for playing fast and loose with it. There's far too much religious ritual in our Christianity today, right across all churches and denominations. All a waste of time, unless the heart attitudes are right. So we've got to be very careful in looking at this. In the middle of Leviticus, there's all these strange food laws and laws that are related to that. The word law is perhaps an unfortunate word. Direction might be a better way of seeing it. It stresses this. That goes right back to Genesis. God is the creator. He made everything and it's all good. But God's people, and God was developing through Moses a people group to be his people group, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These people were called to be different. Different because they reflected the nature of God. And these food principles and guidance, part of it was a visible expression that God is different. God is holy. He is perfect, morally and ethically perfect. He never does anything wrong. And we are called to reflect that in our lifestyle. So it's a visible expression that we are different because we're serving a God who is different. Now the food laws had two purposes. It was practical guidance for a people moving to a new environment. They were going to meet food and animals in situations they'd never met before. They didn't exist in Egypt. But there was a much deeper meaning. This was a physical expression in what they ate and how they ate. That they were different because God is different, because God is holy. God is ethically and morally perfect, and we're called to reflect that nature. Because when we do that, positively and wholesomely, then it makes an impact on people round about. A lesson that we've got to learn again in the 21st century. You see, all of this are visible reminders of their destiny as a nation. God was creating a people group into a nation, a rabble of slaves. But that nation had a destiny. By living for God and reflecting God's nature, they were to make God known to the people groups round about. The only way people can see God in our world today is to see something of Him in the way you and I behave, in the ordinary things of life. And all of this is part of that fundamental principle. Now the New Testament makes it very clear the food laws are no longer required. They served a purpose at the time. Israel as a nation is no longer the vehicle of God's grace. They don't have the destiny they had when they came out as a rabble of slaves from Egypt. Because Jesus came from that nation, and Jesus, through all He did, has made God accessible to all humanity. The job is done. The nation failed in many ways, but they succeeded in many ways. And one of the ways, the greatest way by which they succeeded, was that out of that nation group, Jesus was born and fulfilled in Himself the destiny of the nation. But we, the followers of Jesus, we're called to be distinctive by lifestyle, not by following food rules or do this, do that, or wear this, wear that, go where, here, not go there, but to be positively distinctive. Because by the way we treat others, by the way we live, we reflect the God who made us and made Himself known to us through Jesus. If you like, we'll be distinctive in lifestyle by our lifestyle reflecting the way that Jesus treated people and what He did. Great principles behind it. In Leviticus there's this strange world of uncleanness which is very foreign to our modern way of thinking. We have the idea of holiness. Runs right throughout the book of Leviticus. Different, set apart from God, because it symbolizes perfection. God is morally and ethically perfect. He never does anything wrong. Clean, the concept of cleanness in Leviticus, is that which is seen as normal, fulfilling God's divine purposes correctly. Here was a people group in a stage of transition, very uncomfortable transition. The cultures round about were very different, and some of the things that went on were very, very unsavory, unpleasant. They had to grasp that. Took Moses a while to grasp that. Perhaps that the burning bush was the start. The self-existent God Yahweh, the word that was used, but a God of relationship. Holiness expresses completeness, ethical perfection, things just right. And only when we are perfect and holy can we enjoy God's presence fully. And our lack of perfection in this life is the barrier. Jesus came as the bridge, the place to bridge that barrier. Leviticus addresses that question. If we want to have a relationship with the God of the universe, It starts by a recognition that we've messed up. If we pretend we're good enough, we don't even get to the starting line. The sacrificial system was a visual demonstration so that people could recognize their failure and a rebellion. And of course it pointed to the answer which was fulfilled in the life of Jesus. But then it moves on. It doesn't stop at recognition. It moves on to changing our practical living. How we treat others in the ordinary things of life. And this is where the great principles running throughout the book of Leviticus illustrate how this can be done. They apply to the desert people at the time, but the principles apply to us today. Jesus can bring about the change, but it starts when we recognize and want the change. We recognize we've messed up and we want to move forward into a new quality of living. And Leviticus doesn't separate the religious and the secular. Tragically, we have done that in our world today. We've locked the religious up in our churches and chapels. The way of Jesus interweaves and impacts throughout the whole of life. And what we do within our buildings has no value at all if it doesn't interact totally with how we treat other people in life. Leviticus brings it all together, and it jumps, and we find the jumps uncomfortable, but it's making a point. Life is complete and total. And what goes on within our church buildings should be there to enable us to live more perfect and holy lives in the ordinary things of life. That was the danger, and the people of Israel fell into that trap again and again. Some of the practices of the people group that were living in the land, it was a very small group scattered in little communities. It included child sacrifice. It included temple prostitution. Don't copy that. And Leviticus points them to a higher quality of living, because that reflects God's perfect nature. And we've got to interpret the directions in that context, because that's what Leviticus is doing. It is not a rule book. You can't rip things out and apply them literalistically into the 21st century. It lays down a framework, a set of principles for how we treat each other. And it was given to a people group who just escaped from slavery to prepare them for life in a new environment. But the principles apply everywhere at all times. They had celebrations and festivals. In the spring they celebrated their escape from Egypt, but also the first crops would come. In the summer, the major grain harvests. And in the autumn, the last of the harvest, and bringing the food that would keep them going through the winter. And woven into that, the practical things of the agricultural community were the great spiritual events of the Passover and the Day of Atonement. It speaks about sacred assemblies. An agricultural community where you have to keep going, looking after animals, looking after your crops, sowing and reaping. Times when work stopped, people could get together, celebrations. where they could look back to the past and celebrate all that God had done for them. They could look at the present and celebrate all that God was doing for them right here and now in the provision of the food for the coming months, but also times when they could be together to say, where are we going? We need these precious moments, celebration, just to celebrate all that God has done for us, away from the ordinary pressures of life. Difficult ideas and words, and the danger is we take these ideas and we just transliterate them across in the 21st century into a very different situation, and the words have changed their meaning slightly. You see, the way we look at blasphemy in the modern thought today is the idea of offending the religious sensibilities of others. That's been strongly influenced by Islam. You're not allowed to say anything at all that might offend a Muslim. And if you do, they have the right to retaliate, and they sometimes will do it quite brutally and violently. You cannot comment on the Quran. You cannot comment on Allah. You cannot comment on their dress, their behavior. That's not what the word means biblically. That's a modern invention. And in the Christendom West of the past, we have been guilty of generating that, which is carried over into Islam. That's what the word really meant, a defiant rebellion against God. Asking questions, exploring things, challenging. None of that is blasphemy. Asking questions, why do you dress this way? Should you dress this way? Is this what God wants? None of that's blasphemy. Looking at the religious text and taking it apart, that's not blasphemy. It's defiant rebellion. We've got to interpret it that way. And the whole question of punishment and justice in those days was very different from today. Today, our punishment system is built around prisons, the removal of people from society. They didn't have police forces. They had very limited court systems. And they didn't have prisons. And people lived in extended family groups, and if someone did something particularly wrong, the normal reaction was revenge and a retaliation, sometimes right over the top. And what God was saying to these people, no, that's not the way for you. That's not the way I want you to go. Now, when we look at blasphemy, what the Leviticus text is saying, there is no place amongst God's people for any who are working actively against God by ascribing God's work to the devil. Now, we don't take the law into our hands with any kind of physical punishment, no violence. That's not the way of Jesus. The cultures were different way back in the days of Leviticus. But we've got to watch that we don't allow into our Christian groups people who are undermining all that we're doing. Blatant, defiant rebellion. That's the only meaning of blasphemy. And we've got to see it that way. And that does not in any way restrict us in looking at things critically, weighing the evidence, asking difficult questions. That's nothing to do with blasphemy. But blasphemy led on in the same chapter to the idea of an eye for an eye, which has been ripped out of context. It's idiomatic. It carries a meaning. It's not literalistic. See, that's blasphemy. That's not true. Look at the teaching of Jesus. God is so big, you can't offend God. And I say in passing, in the Islamic world, if there is seen to be a need to defend Allah's reputation, then Allah isn't very big. That's what the word means. And we've got to put it back in this box and see it that way. There are fundamental principles here, but I go straight back to the meaning of words. Now people take that phrase and say it's a set of rules, an eye for an eye. Someone punches me in the face, I punch them back. You demand your rights through retaliation. That's not what it means. There is no place for retaliation at all in the biblical text, in the way of Jesus. An eye for an eye speaks of just retribution. There are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. Don't take personal revenge. Don't retaliate. There's just retribution. And you don't go over the top in that retribution. But you've got to demonstrate there are things that are right, things that are wrong. And when things are wrong, things have to be put right. And if you look at the examples in Leviticus, you can see the principle worked out. It's a restriction. An eye for an eye. And it gives a whole basic principle for justice. A principle that at least in small measure is reflected in many Western countries today in their legal systems. But we've got to return to that, right and wrong. And the definitions of right and wrong. When things are wrong, others get hurt. And that is not what God wants, because God is love. Towards the end of the book in Leviticus 25, this chapter is worth reading again and again. Now, you don't apply it literalistically, because the culture of today is totally different. But the principles stand. What it's basically saying is every person had the inalienable right to family, land, and to freedom. Now, the only way they could get a living in those days was to have a piece of land, a home that was somewhere near it, and they farmed the land. They grew crops, they bred animals, and they did it in security. That's what the principle that it is establishing. And we look at the way society has developed in the last few centuries. At one extreme we've got communism. And what that tends to do is to accumulate all the wealth in the hands of the state. But when we say in the hands of the state, what we mean is in the hands of a few powerful people who are running the system. Now you can see that very clearly. For example, in North Korea, the sheer opulent wealth of the inner group of the leader. And yet most of the population are close to starvation. That's one extreme end. It's a gradation. At the other extreme end, what it can tend to do is that. You're back to the same thing. Most of the wealth ends up in the hands of the few. And you can see that developing in the West, where year by year, over periods of time, the minority is getting richer, the wealth is being concentrated, and the majority don't share it. It's all relative, of course. And some of the salaries and bonuses, I have to say, are simply obscene, in exactly the same way as some of the way the wealth is in the hand of totalitarian leaders, as in North Korea or China. That's obscene as well. Let's look at Leviticus 25. There are great principles here. Remember, people, they didn't have written records. They didn't have calendars. They ran by the movements of the sun and the moon, the seasons of the year. Every seventh day, a break from the routine of hard work. It fits the way our psychology works and our physiques work. But every seventh year, give the land a chance to recover. Reduce your workload. You grow enough food over 6 years to provide for the seventh easily. But it allowed those who were the dispossessed, the refugees and the poor in society to give increased provision. Because you weren't taking all the crops. And then the 49th year, the seventh year. Whether it's the 49th or there's an extra year added on, we're not certain. But the principle applies. An amazing idea that all property and land was restored to the original owner. Remember, the land allocation was given to family groups, not individuals. We could learn something of that today. But what this did was it prevented the accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few. Now, many times that law was not kept going. But there's a glorious principle there. We need to work out some way to do it in our modern societies today. So we've got the principles of 7. That provided for the needs of all. That gave some sort of alleviation for those who are the have-nots, but it also benefited the land. But that gave the dispossessed a fresh start in life. And there are in sections of our population throughout the West, indeed throughout the world, of people who see no hope. They're grinding on, barely surviving. God never intended it to be that way. And while we in the West are living rich lives by comparison, there are so many who have so little. Our society is different. You can't make these as rules to apply today. Again, the danger of literalism. But the principles apply. And what we've got to do within our Christian communities is to work this out. Work it out as a group. Possible ways by which we can help each other. And just here and there you see flickers of this. But I have never yet seen this done on a full scale. Oh, there's a great challenge here from the book of Leviticus. That's the theme of the book. Holiness. That word has got all sorts of wrong overtones and thought forms in our culture today. We dress up in robes and light candles and prance around, and that makes us holy. Nonsense. God is holy because God is separate and different, because God is morally and ethically perfect. That has to be seen in the context of the gods of the nation groups round about the people of Israel at that time. And we are called to reflect that. He says, be holy. You must be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. The people of God, we must reflect the nature of God. That comes in the practical things of life. What we do, how we do it, why we do it, but in particular seen in how we treat each other. We reflect the very nature and character of God. We're called to be mirrors reflecting God. Our lives should be reflecting the very way that Jesus worked in this world. But we're also supposed to be windows where people can see through our lives and they're seeing just something of what heaven is all about. It's not an optional extra. You must be holy is a command. If we are going to make an impact on society, and at the moment we're failing. In the West we're failing miserably. In the rest of the world they're being very successful. If we're going to make an impact, we must reflect the nature of God in our behavior. And I give you that as I conclude, as the message to leave. Holiness means being positively different. Not negatively different, not critical of other people, not condemning things round about, but positively different in how we behave, what we do, how we treat each other. It's practical. The book of Leviticus has great and wonderful lessons to teach us. Lessons that will give us a key so that the people of God in the West can move things forward to make an impact and to fulfill our destiny in exactly the same way as was true in the days when Leviticus was written.